Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel today. I am Brittany Bacon. I'm a partner on Hunton's privacy and cybersecurity team based in New York. For those of you who attended the keynote address this morning, Lisa Soto is one of my partners, and we work very closely together with Mandiant, in particular, on truly catastrophic breaches. For purposes of today's discussion, we're going to focus on cyber threat and risk in the critical infrastructure space. I think this industry, the consequences of attacks in this industry are particularly unique and are worthy of a deeper dive focus and discussion. I'm really excited to be joined today by some very close friends of mine who have been with us in the trenches and are going to impart their wisdom. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Herb to introduce himself.
Thanks, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Herb Stapleton, and I am currently the special agent in charge of the Indianapolis division of the FBI. But prior to escaping the Beltway, I was here in the cyber division at FBI headquarters as a section chief and then the deputy assistant director for 2.5 years.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Wong. I'm a VP of consulting at Mandiant. I've been with the company for about 9 years. I'm based out of New York City. I lead a team that responds to security incidents, on behalf of our companies, but also help them prepare and prevent cybersecurity attacks.
Great, thank you, everyone. My name's Tony Souza. I'm the CISO of Centerpoint Energy in Houston, Texas. Also run enterprise architecture for the company. Been in that role for just over a year. Prior to that, several years with Duke Energy, where I ran their grid and gas security program. A few years with General Electric, Southern companies. I'm in the utility space for quite a while. Ran a consulting company and had 10 years active and 12 in the reserves of the U.S. Army.
Terrific. So while we have a lot to discuss today, we're going to hopefully have a little time for questions at the end. If you guys have a burning question, though, that you cannot resist asking, please raise your hands, shout out, whatever the case may be. We want to make this as useful for you as possible. So without further ado, let's start with kind of understanding the current cyber threat landscape with a particular focus on the critical infrastructure industry. And I'm going to turn it over to Herb. From the FBI's perspective, what are the most significant cyber threats to critical infrastructure that you've been seeing?
I think the thing that we worry most about when as it pertains to critical infrastructure is some type of cyber attack that would result in disruption. And so I think from our perspective, the most obvious risk there is some type of ransomware attack or other disruptive malware attack. I think there's a ton, anything that affects other parts of other industries obviously can equally affect critical infrastructure. But what we worry the most about is the impact that type of attack can have on critical infrastructure can be outsized when compared with other industries. And so we still see a lot of that. We see a lot of attempts to gain access to critical infrastructure networks, but also targeting from the disruptive standpoint as well.
And Tony, from an in-house perspective, talk to us about some of the unique challenges that you grapple with from a critical infrastructure perspective, particularly when we recognize the real convergence that's been happening recently between OT and IT, operational technology and information technology, and why that potentially makes OT more vulnerable and how that shapes the way you approach cybersecurity risk management.
Yeah, really let's start with the IT side of the house. That's always been about confidentiality. We don't want to lose any customer data. That's generally where you get in trouble. But when you get to that operational side of the business, it's all about availability. Whether it's an electric company, gas company, any critical infrastructure, utility type company, you don't want disruption of that critical service. So when you start to look at that space versus the traditional IT space, the first thing you notice is that the dispersion is almost mind-boggling. It is not uncommon to look at a large entity and its assets are spread out over 200,000, 300,000 miles of transmission line or gas line or whatever it may be. The other thing is that the generations of equipment that are in that space, you may have several different generations of equipment from multiple vendors, and trying to keep track of all that from an asset management perspective so that you can seal it off when there's a threat to it, that becomes a very daunting challenge. So just from the baseline of where you start, it's hard. It's a daunting task. The second part of that is, if you go back really over the last several years especially, there's been this thing we call IT/OT convergence. The compute power, whether it be in the cloud, data analytics, limited amount of AI and machine learning, that presents tremendous opportunities to make critical infrastructure businesses more resilient, to be more efficient, to do things like predictive maintenance and a lot of other great things. The challenge with that is you already have a footprint that's spread out over, in many cases, multiple states, very widely dispersed, and now you're adding to the footprint that's out there. And it's not things that you just run down to the data center and check on. So trying to balance, if you think of the mission of cyber in that space, is to protect and enable the business by managing the risk. It's trying to keep all of those things in balance when you have IT/OT convergence. Is how do you keep the risk in check while still allowing the business to drive on? The other thing that goes with that, besides just IT/OT convergence, is when you start to add in things like IoT. People want smart homes, they want smart devices in their homes, they want that to connect back to manufacturers, or they want solar panels that connect into the power grid. Managing all that just ups the risk, and we have to figure out creative ways to manage that.
Hey, Tony, something that you said reminded me of another piece of that, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but one thing that we have experienced in real-world incident responses that we've been a part of is that even when there is an attack that appears to be confined to IT, there can be a business decision or essentially an incident response decision to pull OT, sort of intentionally offline to, preserve or protect that part of it. And, just from the FBI's perspective, when we think about national security and economic security, it doesn't matter whether the attack was actually technically on the IT or the OT, the real world impact is just the same. I don't know if that's something that you experience as well or not.
It's certainly something that we're cognizant of, and we look at when you talk about IT/OT convergence. I think anybody who ever's worked in this space, there's always been this thing about the so-called air gap. More often than not, it's not as air gapped as it should be. But besides that, if you look at some of the incidents that have happened, if you look at things like, if you lose your billing system, can you still operate the company? Can you still deliver the critical services you need? So sitting down and doing the hard analysis of on the back office side, the business side, is there anything in there that's a service or a number of assets or a system that if you lose it, it's really not technically an operational system, but it's still going to slam that operational side. So you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to work towards looking at the ecosystem as a whole.
Dave, before we move on to sort of mitigating risk, preparedness, areas of focus, from your perspective, from the Mandiant perspective, what has this year shown you about the cyber threat landscape? Ransomware, you can't escape talking about that,
Sure.
But talk to us a little bit about what you've seen.
Yeah, I think as it relates to critical infrastructure, we are seeing more destructive attacks. A good example of that was, during the Ukraine-Russia war, there were systems that were intentionally taken out, presumably by the Russians, right? Around things like satellite communications, for example. So, there were systems that were attacked as part of this war. So. And which were for critical infrastructure because these satellite modems were being used for communications for emergency services. It was being used by certain groups within the Ukrainian military, for example. So these were very important things. But I think one really important note about how they responded to that attack was they were able to recover very quickly. So they had plans to be able to essentially re-image, rebuild those modems so that they were able to get back online quickly. And I think one thing that I learned, and hopefully other people can learn from that incident is, being prepared and being resilient, for situations that you might not expect, I think is really key.
Good segue to our next part of the discussion around, mitigation tactics, preparedness activities. As an outside advisor to companies like Centerpoint or to coordinating with law enforcement, what have you seen be some of the most effective ways to protect against or detect more quickly cyber attacks in the critical infrastructure industry? And is it different? Is the preparation different than your routine, non-CI industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brittany, because I think a lot of the techniques are the same, whether it's CI or not. I just think that the stakes are a lot higher when it comes to critical infrastructure. And then when you're responding, you're probably focused more on recovery rather than prioritizing other things like investigations and maybe even communications, right? Like your primary focus generally is on the recovery side. Now, I think Tony brought up some really good points about understanding your systems and the linkages to things that are not necessarily OT. Like Herb, you brought up the ability to sever connections when you see attacks on your IT environment, not the OT environment, right? But if your network is not architected in a way in such that you can pull that lever and segment things, like there might be a lot of levers that you need to pull, and you might not know all those levers unless you plan in advance. So I think that's really important. One of the things that I remember from the keynote this morning, I think it was Kevin that said this, that a lot more companies are doing tabletop exercises. I know you see it, Brittany. You're involved in a lot of them. We're certainly seeing that more on the Mandiant side, but I think with critical infrastructure, I think people are kind of taking it a step further and actually testing out the backups, testing out recovery. And I've heard our clients say that sometimes doing tabletop exercises, it's like playing poker with Monopoly money. If there are not real stakes involved, you're not going to play it in the same way. So taking it to the next level, actually making people go through the process of recovering systems and not even telling them which ones, right? So we've done ones, with Hunton, where in the middle of the exercise, we're all right, we're going to take out that system, and that system, and watch the clock and see them recover and see how quickly they can do it.
Tony, from the in-house perspective, what can be done? What should be the area of focus for mitigating risk and protecting against cyber attacks in the CI space?
Yeah, I think it starts going back to that previous question is understanding the environment, first of all. You can't protect things that you don't know about or that you can't see. So understanding the environment, understanding criticality within the environment. For most of us in the critical infrastructure space, that involves some sort of regulated space. And the things that are in scope for those regulations aren't necessarily all of the business. So a good example is you may have some small facility that would not necessarily catch the radar of the way the regulations are written, but if you go out to that site, it perhaps supports something like a level 1 trauma center. That is not something that you want to have a mishap at or a cyber event there, because it's not just, it's bad all around, and it can be life-threatening in the most serious sense. So first of all, understanding that landscape, what that looks like, and then to Dave's point, sometimes it involves some re-architecting of the network just so that it is optimized in a way that you can protect it. And then from there, it's a concept that sounds really simple, is really hard to execute, which is, we call it know good, K-N-O-W, good. Just know what normal behavior on the network looks like from a cyber perspective. And that's where it varies from IT a little bit, because the protocols, the different ways that things communicate, and the OT side is much, much different in the operational space than the information technology space. And then second of all, once you know what good looks like, is be able to recognize bad and have that throw an alert somewhere. And when you can instrument across a large swath of that landscape that we have, what may look to a normal operator as just a one-time glitch in a system somewhere, or a mechanical or electromechanical failure, all of a sudden you start to see that in 3 or 4 or 5 places. You can recognize the pattern that maybe there's more to it than just a coincidence that 5 things fail at once, and you can get out ahead of the problem. And then the last part of it is take action, which is basically the response function. Because ideally, you'd like to be able to do two things: is first of all limit the damage and contain it so that we don't have a wide swath of some critical infrastructure down for any length of time, and then speed up the recovery response. And as long as you know what's impacted, you know specifically the devices, that you can speed up that process quite a bit. If you make an analogy to things like natural disasters, if it's a hurricane or a tornado, critical infrastructures are typically, companies are typically really, really good at that. They get power back online or other infrastructure back online very quickly. But what is only now really starting to be understood is, what if that hurricane lasted 30 or 40 days? Because while you're trying to bring your stuff back up, there's still an adversary in there pounding you. So having that infrastructure in place that you can use to react to, not just react, but also predict bad things happening is critical.
Dave, you were nodding your head. I felt like you were going to say something, but maybe you're just an enthusiastic listener. Herb, from the FBI perspective, where does the FBI fit into all of this, particularly in the U.S. government's overall effort to protect critical infrastructure from cyber threats?
So yeah, I think there's, I think it's really important to remember that, and all of you know this, but there are a lot of players in the space when it comes to federal government agencies that have an interest in protecting critical infrastructure and specifically protecting it from cyber threats. So whether it may be a regulatory agency, sort of name your regulatory agency, or a department of DHS like CISA, and also the FBI. And so I think we can work effectively with those other agencies in a way that is efficient and has sort of the smallest possible infringement on what you are trying to do from both a preparedness and a recovery standpoint. But the key to all that, I think, is for us to forge a relationship with you as a critical infrastructure organization prior to any kind of incident happening. And so, the FBI's primary role is in threat response. So if there is some type of incident, our primary role is in investigating and assisting victims in the aftermath of that type of incident. However, because we collect intelligence about various types of threats over the course of our investigations and our intelligence, domestic intelligence collection authorities, we also have information that needs to be shared. And so we can do that in a few ways. Sometimes we can share it sort of broadly, and you probably see joint cybersecurity advisories with organizations like CISA or even the NSA, where we will even put out indicators of compromise that are specific to particular critical infrastructure sectors. But there are other things that, because of the way that we collect them, we can't share those broadly. It's just not it's not possible based on policy and legal authority. But if we have something that's tailored to a specific entity, we can share more with you in a one-on-one engagement than we might be able to do in a document that's publicly available. And so it's really important to have that engagement early. The other piece of it is that, the FBI, I think, is the only one of the major cyber incident responders from the government who can be really on any doorstep in the United States within a couple of hours. And so we can have well-trained cyber investigators at your doorstep, if you want them, within a couple of hours. And as we all know, in the aftermath of an incident, time is really of the essence. Like, that's understating it pretty significantly. And so I think those are some of the ways that we can serve in that type of role. The last piece I'll mention is just that we've worked really hard over the past few years in trying to be able to coordinate efforts with the other major cyber agencies within the U.S. government, and I think we've made tremendous strides. While it will never be it can't be a one-stop shop because there are different interests between a regulator, between a law enforcement or intelligence interest, and between an asset response or a protection agency like CISA, we still can reduce redundancies by working together. And anytime you contact the FBI, we'll endeavor to try to make sure that there aren't redundancies in how you have to contact the federal government.
We get that question a lot from our clients as to which is the appropriate agency to go to and when for prophylactic relationship building. How do we decide which field office to contact? Is it where we're based? Is it where we're headquartered? Is it where we have our biggest market presence? What's the difference between the FBI and the Secret Service, et cetera? So could you speak a little bit on that piece? How do they go about?
Absolutely. The answer is the FBI and always. But
there you go. You're not biased at all.
All joking aside, I mean, it definitely depends on what you want. I certainly think that engaging with agencies like CISA prior to an incident, particularly for less cyber mature types of agencies that may need some assistance and guidance on sort of the latest and greatest from a protection or prophylactic standpoint, is really important. I think you also have to ask yourself, though, whom will you need in the aftermath of an incident? I think that the FBI is best positioned to lead that response, just because that is really our role in the overall atmosphere. We'll still pull CISA in so that you have sort of a full picture, but that's the really important piece of it. And then, obviously we partner really closely with the Secret Service. We work a ton of joint cases with them, and so we never try to work in sort of friction or contradiction to what they're doing. I think it is important to remember that the Secret Service has a relatively narrow slice of the 18 USC 1030 sort of authority. They're focused on cyber criminal threats, and as we know, a cyber incident caused by a malicious actor to critical infrastructure easily could be a cyber criminal threat. It could also be a nation-state actor, which is where the FBI's joint cyber and counterintelligence authorities, I think, really, really shine. And so the bottom line answer to that, the short way of saying it is, if you call CISA, or if you call the FBI, or if you call the Secret Service, my hope is, and I believe it to be true in most parts of the country, that you'll get the full force of the federal government to assist you in any way possible. But FBI and always. That's
You remember nothing else from this panel. There you go. So I'll chime in from the legal perspective, because why not? Although, allegedly, I just learned this fun fact about this panel. Something we all share in common is we all apparently took the LSAT. Some of us actually took it and went to law school and became lawyers and practiced law, and that's just me. You are a lawyer, right?
I am, and I did practice law.
You did practice law,
Not very
too.
Successfully. That's why I had to change careers.
No, that's not true. And then our tech guys over here apparently, just for fun, tried out taking the LSAT. So I will offer, the legal perspective. When we're working with our critical infrastructure clients, as Dave mentioned, the preparedness work is not particularly different from other industries, although warrants, I think, some of pushing the limits on the business continuity aspect, the disruption focus certainly, but a couple quick reminders. So goes without saying, but having a workable incident response plan that actually is understood and reflects a multi-stakeholder effort, not just tech focused. Yes, you need your tactical playbooks, absolutely, but it does have to recognize that in the event of an incident, it is so not just a CISO problem, it is so not a forensic specialist problem, it is a fundamental company risk issue problem that needs to be managed from a legal perspective, a comms perspective, an HR perspective, an executive perspective, investor relations perspective. So making sure that your incident response plan has been updated and tested, of course, in the form of tabletops, et cetera. Another thing, get ahead of identifying your preferred partners. Obviously for law firms, Hunton and always, is that the expression? Hunton, Andrews, Kurth, and always. But beyond law firms, identify your preferred security firm, Mandiant. Identify your preferred ransomware specialist, which is not Mandiant. And there is a pretty small coterie of ransomware specialists that do this and do this really well. So figure out who those are, who you want to work with. Consider putting them on a retainer, given serious bandwidth issues that have come to bear of late. PR firms, not just your run-of-the-mill PR that handles normal crisis response. There are cybersecurity specific specialists that really do and have managed some of the worst PR disasters that result from these types of attacks. Cyber insurance, really quickly, and we'll pick up on this if we get to talk a little bit about Uber. But make sure your insurance, you have endorsed to your policy your preferred vendors. Make sure your D&O coverage or some other coverage appropriately protects people who may face, individual criminal liability. And last but not least, make sure the relationship between legal, and this is a little self-serving on my part, but I do think it's true, make sure that partnership with legal and security is ironclad. Like, we are here to help you. We're not here to slow you down. We're not here to stop you from doing your job. But it can be an incredibly effective partnership and will help you get the leverage and the buy-in you need, I think, from the executive level when you start framing cybersecurity risk as a fundamental risk issue for the company, which obviously the board cares about, senior leadership cares about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about in this discussion. Okay, so moving on to what can we do ahead of time you're in the throes, you're in the trenches, you're actively responding to a cyber event in the critical infrastructure space. So Dave, how does a critical infrastructure company's response to a cyber attack differ from that of other companies, if at all?
Yeah, I think there are differences here. The focus on containment and recovery is certainly a priority, and it's a priority over, a lot of other things that, might be more of an issue in a financial firm or, in a different type of company where you might be looking at like losses, if you were a retailer, right? You might be looking about potential lawsuits if you're a public company, but, I almost feel like you have to raise yourself to a higher bar and, because you are running critical infrastructure, be focused on the right things. And so sometimes things, that you hear that are like conventional wisdom, on the communication side, for example, right? Where like I think you'll hear firms say like, if you have, a credit card breach, like, don't go out and announce right away, like do the whole investigation, go figure out like how many cards were impacted and which cards and whatnot, and then go out at once. I don't think you have that luxury with critical infrastructure. Like the expectation is you're gonna communicate and communicate frequently. And it's not unlike a natural disaster, Tony, right? Like, if there's an outage due to a hurricane, like you're like, this is how many people are impacted. We're still investigating, we're still working on things. But I think you need to get out there in front with things like communications. Herb, you mentioned how there's so many different federal agencies, as well as like non-state and local agencies that get involved. And, in my experience, like they can almost barrage you, like if you're the first time going through an incident where, you're talking to the FBI, they're asking for an update, right? DHS and CISA might be involved, and then, the DOE or, TSA, like there are all these other groups, not to mention, state and local agencies that are kind of constantly want updates. So you almost have to have, a separate working group just to deal with like the comm side. And I think if we go back to the preparation side, if you have those relationships up front, if you talk to those people and set expectations about like who actually might be the lead agency, at least on the federal side, of kind of gathering that information, I think it'll help you focus back on the IT stuff that you really need to focus on.
Tony, would love your thoughts on that. So, kind of reacting to what Dave just said about the areas of focus and then more specifically on the communication piece, whether it's communicating with the respective regulators or even communicating internally but upward, what is the best strategy? What are some of the challenges you face when in the heat of response to keep everybody apprised?
Yeah, in the heat of response, it's too late to actually be trying to figure out what your response plan looks like. So just drilling it. You covered many of the areas that you need to look at from having the partnerships in place.
Yep.
When one of the things that works really well, it's really hard to do a top-down, bottom-up exercise from the board all the way down to the individual contributors going to be doing some tactical task to remediate a problem. But what you can do is you can run, I will take a section of the incident response plan, and down in my operations center, we'll run that every week. And sometimes we run it against real world scenarios that if another company's had a problem or whatever, we'll run our plan against their incident to see how it stacks up and tune it based on that. And then I think at the other end of the spectrum, up at the board level, that really comes down to having a common risk model and risk framework that the board is accustomed to hearing about. Years ago as a consultant, I had the privilege of sitting down over a number of seminars with board members, and I asked them, what do they like about good communication from cyber, and what do they think is bad communication? It was almost like they'd gone to the same lecture elsewhere and had it carved into some stone tablets, that they all said the same thing. Cyber always comes in and scares the life out of us, and then the second thing they do is they talk in technical gobbledygook that none of us can understand, and then they always leave asking for money and more people. So if you can get out of that, have a common risk model that you talk about, and having that as part of your regular board cadence, and that's the baseline that you work off of. When you have an incident, that actually folds in and dovetails nicely with your incident response plan, because people are starting to hear the same vernacular they're accustomed to hearing, and they can tie it to whatever the big strategic risks are for the company in cyber. They understand that if you look at the capabilities within a model, on the incident response side, what of that is being exercised, and if it's adequate, so that when you're asking for resources you might not normally ask for, they're outside the company, they have an understanding from knowing what your capability model is. Yeah, that's not inside the company. We have to go get additional help.
Great. And then Herb, how is the FBI's response to critical infrastructure cyber threats different, if at all, from cyber threats to the non-CI industries?
Yeah, I think the initial response that you can expect is, I hope, very consistent across all industries. I think where the difference lies with critical infrastructure is, the truth of the matter is that the landscape out there is really just too vast for an in-depth response from the FBI to every single cyber incident all across the country every day. We don't have enough people for that. And so we have to do some prioritization as well. And so one of the things that we talk about is how cybersecurity is national security, and that really has to be our focus. And so anytime there is a cyber incident that impacts critical infrastructure in any kind of material way, the FBI is going to prioritize that particular response. I think we absolutely have to. It's part of our national security response obligation, if you will. And so I think that part of this is not just from the FBI, but because when there is a breach or a cyber incident at a critical infrastructure entity, there are just a lot more questions from not just from the FBI, but from the administration or Congress or whatever other parts of government. And so as a result of that, we're going to posture ourselves in a way that we hope makes it easier for you to respond to all those questions. And one of the ways we do that is by trying to consolidate sort of the communication with the U.S. government, whether that's through the FBI or through some other entity. And in the critical infrastructure responses that I've been a part of, particularly in my time at Cyber Division, we've had some success in being able to do that. We've also had some ones that were not so successful, but I think the key, from my perspective, the key message I would want you to have is that reaching out early through counsel, we're very sort of adept or used to, at this point, working through your legal counsel, in-house or retained counsel, whichever it is, to try to get to the best result for both the government and the victim of the incident. So that's the way that I would see, you kind of need to accept, we all need to accept that the questions of us, both as the victim and as responding agency, are going to come faster and more furious in the case of critical infrastructure, because there's just going to be heightened interest. And so working together to kind of manage that beast is in the best interest of the country and of you as critical infrastructure.
So just to pick up on a few things each of you said, we routinely work with our clients to understand the role of the board in managing cybersecurity risk, whether it's proactively or in the event of an incident. And on the proactive side, to Tony's point, the first time the board hears about cyber threats and cyber risk should not be in the midst of an incident. That's way too late. They should be sensitized to this, way before. And that involves regular and, depending on your board structure, it could be a quarterly cadence, but some sort of regular reporting up, whether it's by the CISO or some other function. Sometimes it's the general counsel in parallel, making sure the board understands what is the current threat landscape specific to your industry. How do you compare? They love benchmarking, as far as I can tell, right? How do you compare to your peers? Are you doing enough? Do you have what you need? Because board members do have fiduciary duties of loyalty and care that do come into play, and we've seen, be the subject of derivative shareholder lawsuits brought against board members who failed to exercise those duties because they did not, ask for and ensure that they were receiving those kinds of updates on a regular basis. As far as the response goes, and this, ties into the incident response plan and kind of thinking ahead, typically we try to build in some sort of escalation process and severity classification that says if an incident is level P, 1 through 3, or S, level 0 through 2, these automatically will be escalated to XYZ senior leadership and or the board, full board or potentially audit committee or chair, et cetera. And then for other, type level of severity classifications, it's at the discretion of fill in the blank, general counsel, CEO, et cetera. But understanding and identifying ahead of time what are the triggers and what are the parameters, and have the board be okay with that and buy into that, I think is incredibly important. Herb mentioned legal counsel being involved in the law enforcement outreach. Again, without sounding self-serving, I highly do encourage our clients, our CISOs, and other security-focused personnel to use legal to just act as a conduit. It's not to stop the communication, it's not to prevent you from sharing information, but to just make sure we're doing it in the most thoughtful and company-protective way. Privilege, that's a word I will be saying throughout the investigation and the response, and if we inadvertently share information outside of the approved process and the protocols, it really comes back to bite you. All right, so apparently we do have some time left over for my lightning round type of questions. Although before I get into it, does anyone have any immediate questions with some of the things we've talked about? Don't all put your hands up at once, no? Good, Out of curiosity, how many are in-house, like security personnel within their companies? I can barely see anybody right now, but I think I see
There's a question
few
right
hands. Oh, it's a question. Okay. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for holding this. I'm curious about anyone up here, your views on how the administration or how agencies are handling, rulemakings regarding critical infrastructure protections. So I know CISA is formulating a rulemaking requiring incident reporting. I know DHS has doled out funding. I think it was $1 billion in funding that would help small critical players implement these protections. I mean, what's your take on the landscape here?
Who wants to start, or I'll chime in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, the regulatory frameworks, we're fully supportive of them as a critical infrastructure provider. The thing that we strive for is, you named a number of them right out the gate. I think there's two parts to that. One is just making sure that they line up, because it's not just at the federal level, it's at the state and local level. And what we don't want is in the middle of an incident to be overwhelmed by the administrative part of the reporting of that when we're trying to recover from it. So we want to make sure that that the reporting thresholds aren't all completely misaligned, so that it's confusing to figure out what you're supposed to do when. The other part of that, it's a really good question, is that when you take out the large entities that do this type of work, the small ones, if you added up the territory that they serve, that tends to be a lot of territory, and that's a lot of people and a lot of customers. But those companies don't necessarily always have even it's not just a question of funds, it's a question of getting skills and expertise and staff out to them. Because even if you could give them a ton of money, but a lot of them have small staffs. So that's something that in the industry that we're working on to try to figure out how we can partner with some of the smaller companies, because one way or another, all of them eventually touch each other in some way or fashion, to make sure that we do get coverage everywhere and nobody's left out.
I'll say two things really quick because there may be other questions. The first one is, of course, I can't comment on any specific rulemaking, but I will say just when it comes to sort of a reporting structure, I think it's really important that we have a reporting structure that is common sense and spells out really clear guidelines for all of you. I think that's just been a challenge for the whole ecosystem, private, government, et cetera, that is sort of left up to individual entities to decide what they can or should report. And so I think just having some clear lanes in the road is really important. The second piece I would talk about is I do think that with smaller entities that sort of have a critical role in the overall infrastructure of the nation, that's a place where the FBI's ability to have a local touch can be really valuable. And so I wholly support more funding for DHS and others to provide support to those entities. But I do think that when you need to have someone face to face, that the FBI is in every state. There's a cyber investigator in all 56 field offices all across the country. So having the ability to have that one-on-one conversation could be really helpful, and I just really urge you to do that if you haven't already.
I think there are two key challenges to this patchwork quilt of disclosure-related, reporting-related regulations and laws. One is, depending on the nature of the incident, and it may involve personal information, which is subject to 50 different U.S. state breach notification laws. It may involve, covered critical infrastructure, which is potentially subject to CISA reporting requirements, or it may involve a material event that has SEC disclosure implications. And there is no singular standard that applies, just because you are regulated by XYZ, you can only think about them. You unfortunately have to consider this patchwork quilt. I think the other challenge is there's some really aggressive timelines being proposed in these regulations, as you know. We've got, 72 hours with CISA. We have 4 days with SEC proposed disclosures. We have, God forbid you're subject to New York DFS, 72-hour reporting requirement, which are sort of out of step with what we've been living with for the past decade or so under the U.S. state breach notification laws, which were historically much more focused on personal information and afforded companies, at a minimum 30 days to issue appropriate notifications because they recognize these investigations take time. I think it's, potentially imposing unrealistic expectations on companies in the private sector and is not a full appreciation for how long this stuff can take, not to mention how much you need your resources to be focused on the actual containment and investigation versus who do we have to notify. But I also get why regulators and the government need to know as soon as possible and need to communicate to consumers to the extent it affects them. So it's a real challenge. Any other, I think we have a minute and 17 seconds if anyone else has another question. Otherwise, we'll go to our look in your crystal ball and tell us, what does the future hold, guys? Is it more of the same, more ransomware, or what's the new threat we should be thinking about?
I think if we look at what happened in the Ukraine-Russia war, we saw cyber attacks prior to the kinetic attacks, and I do wonder about future attacks in other countries. You think China, Taiwan, for example, and what may come of that. So I think that's a question. I think the other thing that we're starting to see is with some of the criminal gangs, they're working with what appears to be organized crime, and then there's other types of more physical attacks like swatting and physical threats against executives of companies. So that's a troubling trend that we're starting to see, and I hope that does not come true.
I think ransomware is going to continue to be a thing as long as market forces allow it to be a thing. As long as it's as profitable as it currently is, we're going to continue to see that as a primary tactic. When we look really over the horizon, I think the things that we think about as emerging are a couple of things. One is just sort of technologies that aren't fully kind of developed right now, like AI type technologies, and how can that be leveraged for sort of malicious purposes? And then, who are the other sort of adversary, when I think about it from a national security perspective, a U.S. national security perspective, who are the other adversaries that are sort of developing? We have specific, cyber adversaries who have really good capabilities, in particular, but obviously other countries are developing those. And how will that sort of play out, and how will they choose to use their capabilities as they develop them? That's one of the things we do a lot of thinking about.
Tony, any final thoughts to leave this wonderful group with?
Just when you talk about critical infrastructure, I mean, that impacts all of us. A lot of things we take for granted. The lights are on in here, the screens are working, everything else. You notice it right away when that goes out. So it's something that's it's a national challenge. It's a national security challenge. And it's something that we keep working at, and there's never enough people to work on it. So encourage your friends. It's a good place to work right now.
Putting aside the Uber. No, I'm kidding. All right, well, thank you guys so much for your attention, and happy to take any questions up here afterwards, but appreciate it.